Hello and welcome back to TDNY. You ain't got no alibi. Wait. TDNY, this day, not year. That's better. The podcast where we look at the unique and interesting history from the week ahead. And on this episode, we learn where the brightest lights in Bright Light City were, what an early speeding fine would cost you, what an Earth buddy was, and when Boston was invaded by the Mooninites, and much more along the way. So, jumping right into Monday, January 27th. It wouldn't be a TDNY episode without some nuclear incident, and this is no exception, as, on this day, not year, America detonated a 1-kiloton nuclear bomb, nicknamed Shot Able, about 65 miles, or 104 kilometers, outside of the Bright Light City itself, Las Vegas, Nevada. This was the start of the Nevada Test Site, or Nevada Proving Grounds, that would go on to see over 900 nuclear detonations between 1951 to 1992. It all started thanks to Project Nutmeg in 1948. America had developed a nuclear bomb, but they weren't finished yet. Wanting to do more testing, improving, experimenting on the weapon, they started exploding away bits of the Marshall Islands and Bikini Atoll. But the distance and cost of getting equipment over there was getting to be a real pain in the logistics. So, the new bright idea was to detonate them all in America instead. They just had to find the right spot, which was the goal of Project Nutmeg. A little radioactive spice to make existence extra nice. 5 locations were considered, ranging from Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and North Carolina. But eventually one of the 2 Nevada locations was chosen. It was land the government already owned, being part of the Nellis Air Force Gunnery and Bombing Range. While that small town of 20,000-odd people, Las Vegas, was probably far enough away from any negative side effects. Besides, Russia had recently performed their first nuclear test, and now the heat was on to stay the leader in this mounting Cold War. So the military started testing, and America turned up for the show. Many of these tests were conducted between 4 and 5 a.m., when the wind conditions were thought to be optimal for not carrying radiation. They would light up the dark morning sky with each atomic blast. Troy Wade, of the DOE, Department of Energy, worked at the Nevada test site and could attest to the display. The sky would light up as if it were daylight for just a second or so, but brilliantly daylight from the test that was going off 90 miles away. It wasn't just Troy that thought the display brilliant. Many families would get up at the crack of dawn and set off to get as close to the explosion as they were allowed, picnicking away as the early morning nuclear explosions bathed them in the brilliant light, turning night into daytime. As for those still sleeping at home, supposedly the blasts could be so strong that they would be thrown from their beds, if the shattering windows and cracking foundations didn't wake them up first. As the years went on and the tests continued, larger crowds were drawn in, and all the while Las Vegas continued to grow. It wasn't long before the more affluent would start having dawn or atomic cocktail parties hosted on the city's rooftops. They would party the night away before turning to the horizon just in time to watch the explosion light the place up and the blossoming mushroom cloud bloom over the horizon. Ooh, just as an aside, if you want to live like you're at an atomic party, sans the radioactive light show, here's a recipe for an atomic cocktail of the day. Take equal parts vodka, brandy, or cognac if you're feeling bougie with your booze, and champagne. Stir or shake the vodka and brandy over ice with a little sherry. Strain into glass and add the dry champagne. Garnish with an orange slice and flash bam alakazam. Admire that orange-colored dram. Now, you may be thinking that this seems like a pretty good time. Parties, drinks, light shows, all on the backdrop of Las Vegas glitz and glamour. Unfortunately, and perhaps predictably, When you're playing around with this much radiation, it isn't all fun and games. While care was taken to only test on days with still or favourable winds, this didn't always play out. The downwinders, or towns or areas unfortunate enough to cop frequent doses of radiation, saw an increase in cancers, leukemias, and tumours. This even affected a 1956 John Wayne movie. The Conqueror, filmed downwind of the testing, was a whitewashed Genghis Khan epic. During filming, the horses would kick up a lot of dust, coated in radioactive fallout, that would lazily drift around the cast and crew clinging to them. In the following years, 91 of the 220-strong crew developed cancer or ill effects from this radiation. The last nuclear test conducted by the US was in 1992 at the Nevada test site. As for a song to cover this story, well, there are options. I'd like to use some Tom Lehrer here, with We Will All Go Together When We Go, but given the location, I don't think I can go past Viva Las Vegas. But rather than the version from Mr. Atomic Bomb singer Elvis Presley, let's have the Dead Kennedys' grimier version to end this story on. Moving right along, speeding along, you could say, to Tuesday, January 28th, and a world first on this day, not year, when a Mr. Walter Arnold was first to achieve something in a car, or locomotive, if we were to use the lingo of the day, old chap. The year was 1896, and the first car, or at least the first patented one, the Benz patent motor car, was a day away from turning 10. Mr. Arnold of East Peckham, Kent, England, had imported his direct from Germany the year prior, and was seemingly so impressed by the machines he had become one of the earliest car dealers in England. Today we find him out for a joyride in his Benz motor. Driving through the village of Paddock Wood, Mr. Arnold sped by fields of fruit and hops, the town's specialties, at a breakneck pace of 8 miles, or 13 kilometers per hour, while today this is the equivalent of a fairly leisurely bicycle ride. Back in 1896, it was not only top speed, it was also illegal. The speed limit of the day was a very sedate 2 miles, or 3.2 kilometers per hour. So when Mr. Arnold drove by a police officer while doing 4 times over the speed limit, the chase was on. Fortunately, the officer was mounted on his trusty bike, and after some furious pedaling in the interim, had halted Mr. Arnold and presented him with 4 counts on which he was to face charges. Those counts? Using a locomotive without a horse, having fewer than 3 persons in charge of the locomotive, not displaying your name and address on the locomotive, and finally, travelling at a greater rate than 2 miles per hour. Yes, Walter Arnold had just become the first person in the world to receive a speeding fine for driving a car. His total fine for all 4 offences was £4 and 7 shillings, while the individual charge for the speeding fine was just 10 shillings, or half a pound, equivalent at the time to about a day's worth of wages for a skilled labourer. Today, those 10 shillings would be worth a little over £53, with inflation, which overall was pretty cheap for a speeding ticket today. As today in Australia, speeding fines are organised into brackets, and although they differ from state to state, they're usually along the lines of exceeding speed by less than 10 kilometres, between 10 to 15 kilometres, 15 to 20 kilometres, etc., up to 45 kilometres over the speed limit. Just for your own information, the cheapest fine you'll face is in Tasmania, with a fine of $98 for exceeding the limit by less than 10 kilometres. Conversely, the harshest penalty you'd face from speeding is in New South Wales, where you would be fined up to $2,967 for doing 45 kilometres an hour over the speed limit in a school zone. Which, if you think that's rich, allow me to tell you of a story from Switzerland in 2010. They do things a little different over there. Instead of a set fine amount, citizens are charged based on their annual income. A quick aside, America follows a similar system for charging their criminals. The richer you are, the less consequences you face. But I digress. Anyway, this system saw, as reported by the BBC in 2010, an unnamed 37-year-old caught while travelling 170 kilometres over the speed limit, which led to a fine of 1.08 million Swiss francs, which in Australia today is just over $2 million. Jumping back to 1896 to conclude this day and story, while Walter Arnold was charged and even had to forfeit his licence for a short period, his case did change the law. It was seen that 3 people were no longer required to operate a vehicle, and, more importantly, the speed limit rose from 2 miles per hour up to 14, or about 23 kilometres an hour. As for Arnold, shortly after his antics, he started selling a variation of the Benz patent motor, a car he christened the Arnold. Only one song comes to mind for this story. A low-speed police chase? I Can't Turn You Loose by the Blues Brothers, the song used in that iconic mole chase scene. Sticking in England, we come from a story about speeding to one that saw traffic come to a standstill, as on this Wednesday, 29th of January, London saw a smog so thick that it registered higher on the milligrams per cubic metre than the Great London Smog of 1952, that just 7 years earlier had killed an estimated 10 to 12,000 people. Now, first off, fog, smog, what's the difference? Fog is basically ground-level cloud. Although there are a few different varieties, most commonly it forms on the hot ground of day, radiates away the heat at night, cooling the surrounding air and condensing the water droplets, which are light enough to remain floating in the air above the ground, forming the cloud-like fog. Smog, meanwhile, is a portmanteau of smoke and fog, and as the name suggests, smog is a result of smoke, from factories, household stoves, fireplaces, etc., becoming trapped within the cool and damp fog-producing air. So, as the cool winter air settles over the London streets on this morning in 1959, the smoke from factories and households becomes trapped and forms a thick, hazy smog over the city. Although London had established the Clean Air Act back in 1956, as an attempt to regulate the smoke-forming air pollution by changing over to smokeless fuels and further shifting to gas and electricity for power, it wasn't being enacted fast enough. A reading from the Greenwich Laboratory showed the atmospheric pollution of smoke to be at 2.48 milligrams per cubic metre during the 1959 smog event, while the Great Smog of 1952 only ever reached 2.1 milligrams. As commuters woke up this morning, they found that the visibility for nearly 40,000 miles of road was down to 10 metres at the maximum, with many stretches of smog so dense you couldn't even see a metre in front of you. Cars were abandoned on the roads as attempts of travel were deemed too dangerous. Those who did brave the conditions were faced with bumper-to-bumper traffic jams. An AA spokesman was quoted as saying, "It is a motorist's nightmare as rush-hour drivers grope their way through nil visibility." The London airport was in total lockdown, with no planes flying out or allowed in. Throughout the day, 44 scheduled outbound flights had to be cancelled and 30 incoming flights diverted to unaffected airports, which caused its own panic, as many of these smaller airports weren't used to such volume, and further cancellations were seen as there was no room left to take off from. Although, perhaps in an enduring display, highlighting that airways have never truly changed, throughout the day the British Overseas Airways Corporation still accepted passengers at the London airport, let them pass through customs, check in their baggage, etc., only to then tell them that all flights had been cancelled. Bus and train services were also either cancelled entirely or running delayed, as drivers couldn't get to work, and those who could were faced with the same conditions as everyone else. Despite conditions worse than the Great Smog of 1952, I can't find any reports of an increase in respiratory deaths from the toxic conditions. Plenty of people affected and rushed to the hospital, yes, but no deaths. Perhaps one reason for this, outside of reduced pollution from the Clean Air Act, was the use of our own enduring pandemic symbol, the mask. Chemists reported a large increase of smog mask sales, with one selling out entirely by 10 a.m. that morning. Although it wasn't for sale yet, the latest in mask technology of 1959 was something straight out of science fiction. If you're able, go to YouTube and search "Masks Beat Smog 1959" to see a lady demonstrating the latest in mask fashion straight from France, including a full bubble mask covering her head, complete with holes to allow straws for sipping at cups of tea. The only real accident I could find that occurred during the smog was one reported in the Friday, January 30th edition of the Canberra Times, which stated, "A passenger train ran into the rear of a stationary freight train in the thick fog at Esher, Surrey, last night. First report suggested a serious crash, and police cars and ambulances were rushed to the scene. However, only one man, the guard on the freight train, suffered major injuries." So, the 1959 London smog came and went. The Canberra Times reporting on the 2nd of February 1959, "The two-day fog which paralysed transport throughout London lifted yesterday, and visibility became normal." The most fitting song I could find for this story comes from The Night Monitor, a UK-based band creating, as per their Spotify page, soundtracks inspired by vintage paranormal events. So, for today, A Patch of Fog by The Night Monitor. Another week, another patent. Submitted on this day, Thursday 30th of January, but not this year, was patent HU170062B. While it was originally submitted on this day in 1975, it wasn't approved until later that year. Unfortunately, the original patent is in Hungarian, but we do have a later English patent of the same invention. See if you can guess what it is. Three-dimensional puzzles, with slidable or rotatable elements or groups of elements. The main configuration remaining unchanged, with an element, invisible core, staying permanently in a central position, having the function of central retaining spider, and with groups of elements rotatable about at least 3 axes. It does go on, but that should be a bit of a clue. Have you got it yet? Maybe you have? But for those still trying to make the pieces fit together, allow me to give you one more clue. The inventor's name. Erno Rubik. Yes, that's right. On this day in 1975, the magic cube was invented. Magic cube, you ask? Well, that was the original name. The name change only happened after Erno had put some for sale in 1977, and they made their way to Ideal Toys in 1979, a company looking to sell them globally. But they wanted a more marketable name, so Rubik's Cube was born. Interestingly, and I can't find why, the brand Rubik's Cube is trademarked in many countries around the world, except for in Australia. Here we just have it down as Rubik's, as submitted by Spin Master Toys UK Limited. If you go to their website, you'll find it listed as the official Rubik's. As a quick aside, the first creation of Spin Master Toys was the Earth Buddy, a nylon stocking-covered head of sawdust topped with grass seeds which grew to emulate hair. So just think a cheap budget chia pet. But back to Erno. He originally had created the cube, not with any idea of selling it as a puzzle, but as a way to solve a tricky mechanical problem he was facing, trying to create a model of many blocks that wouldn't fall apart while moving around each other. The story goes he originally coloured each side, and after twisting them all around, spent over 4 weeks trying to solve his puzzle, which is an understandable challenge, as a standard Rubik's Cube has over 43 quintillion different permutations it can be twisted into, which, according to Wikipedia, if each permutation was its own cube, you would be able to stack them into a tower 261 light years tall. He wasn't alone in wanting to solve the Rubik's Cube either. In 1981, James G. Norse released a book titled The Simple Solution to Rubik's Cube. That year, it went on to sell 6.6 million copies. To put that into some perspective, convicted felon Donald Trump's ghost-written book, The Art of the Deal, as of 2016, has sold an estimated 1.1 million copies. This wasn't James G. Norse's only contribution to the Rubik's Cube. He also set down the ranks for speed cubing or speed solving, those who try and solve a cube in the quickest time possible. If you could solve one in 20 minutes, you were a whiz. 10 minutes, a speed demon. 5 minutes, you're an expert, while under 3 minutes would make you an MC, or Master of Cube. Those ranks would quickly become meaningless as people started finding ways to solve them in well under 3 minutes. As of today, the world champion is American Max Park, who in 2023 was able to solve a standard 3x3x3 cube in just 3.13 seconds. Max also holds the speed record for the 6x6x6 cube and the 7x7x7 cube, with 58.03 and 94.15 seconds respectively. As we near the 50th anniversary of the Magic/Rubik's Cube being on sale, is it still the cultural icon that it once was? Well, as of January 2024, it had sold over 500 million units, making it one of, if not the best-selling toys of all time. It's probably no surprise that there are many Rubik's Cube-inspired songs, but after sorting through, somewhat less than 43 quintillion of them, I'm fairly confident that Scottish band Dictator and their song Rubik's Cube is the perfect match for this story. Friday, January 31st, the time when Boston was nearly eradicated by aliens from the moon. It all started on this day back in 2007 at 8:05 a.m. A member of the public, travelling by Interstate 93, spotted a suspicious device attached to a support stanchion of the interstate. Wires, batteries, a circuit board. In this post-9/11 world, the citizen knew exactly what they were looking at. A bomb. Specifically, an IED, or an improvised explosive device. In a quick game of telephone, pretty soon the bomb squad were on the scene. Not just the bomb squad, but what was described as an army of emergency vehicles arrived to deal with the device. Parts of the interstate were shut down, the area was sectioned off, and public transport was halted. With all of this playing out in a very public space, news crews were also quick to start broadcasting. Soon, local news presenters were blasting the public with stories about the IED. Panic only continued to grow as throughout the day, more of these devices were found, causing more areas to be cordoned off, more traffic halted, with even boat traffic stopped for one of the devices. They wouldn't know it at the time, but in total, 38 of them had been planted around the city. A Fox News presenter is quoted as saying, "As you might imagine, this has created chaos across the city of Boston." For all the panic the public were feeling, 2 men had it even worse. Peter Badovsky and Sean Stevens had been following the events all day. They knew exactly what the devices were and where they would be found, because, after all, they had been paid $300 to plant them. Were these 2 men domestic terrorists? No, far from it. They had been contracted by marketing company Interference Inc. to place guerrilla marketing advertisements around the city for an upcoming movie. Aqua Teen Hunger Force, was an animated TV show that debuted on the Adult Swim block of the Cartoon Network channel on September 9th, 2001. A surrealist comedy show detailing the adventures of anthropomorphic food items. A serve of fries named Frylock, a milkshake named Master Shake, and an uncooked meatball named Meatwad. And in 2007, they were releasing their first movie. A set of reoccurring antagonists in the series are the Mooninites, two-dimensional, 8-bit aliens who live on the moon. It was the Mooninites' simple appearance that inspired this particular bit of guerrilla marketing. An LED arrangement resembling a Moonanite, powered by some simple batteries, wires, and all placed on a 30 by 40 centimeter circuit board, to be hung in dark areas for pedestrians to see and spread some word of mouth for the upcoming movie. When all was said and done, Boston officials came away pretty red-faced from the experience and subsequent social panic they had caused, with some comparing it, in an appropriately thematic way, to the fictionalized panic the radio broadcast of War of the Worlds had caused. The city was further humiliated when it was discovered they weren't the only ones targeted by this marketing stunt, and other major cities had their Moonanite LED signs up for as much as 3 weeks without causing a public panic. Perhaps due to their embarrassment, the city refused to back down, and eventually the parent company behind Cartoon Network, Turner Broadcasting System, had to pay the city of Boston $2 million, while Peter and Sean, after holding a press release on the recognition of 1970s hairstyles, their lawyer advised them not to mention anything about the LED IEDs, were sentenced to community service. The Aqua Teen Hunger Force movie went on to make $5.5 million at the box office on a budget of just $750,000. While searching for a song that fits this story, I was originally thinking along the lines of Space Invaders by Player One, or the Aqua Teen Hunger Force theme. But while trawling through my playlist for inspiration, I stumbled upon the perfect fit. Questionable Art in Public Spaces, a song by experimental band Tamaga. We delve back into the world of cricket for Saturday the 1st of February, as on this day, not year, the New Zealand cricket team are 6 for 221 and facing the last over of the match. To beat Australia, they need to hit 15 off this last over. After a 4 on the first ball, a wicket on a second, 2 runs off the third and another 2 off the fourth, the fifth is another wicket. With 1 ball remaining, they can no longer win, but hitting a 6 will draw the game. It was this day in 1981 when bowler Trevor Chappell performed one of the most controversial cricketing acts on the instruction of his captain and brother Greg Chappell, by bowling the ball underarm along the pitch, making the required 6 to draw an impossible feat. New Zealand batter Brian McKechnie barely puts any effort into blocking the ball before throwing his bat in the air and walking off. Although bowling underarm is an act that had been banned in the United Kingdom with the ruling, "No bowler may deliver the ball underarm," it was not a rule in the Australian playbook at the time. Commentator Richie Benaud said on that day of the rule, "I hope they put it in by tomorrow morning, otherwise there'll be a lot of criticism for what was a disgraceful performance out there today." And that it was one of the worst things I've ever seen done on a cricket field. It wasn't just Richie that found the act disgraceful. The New Zealand team, back in their dressing room, were dead quiet, defeated and stunned by the act, when player Mark Burgess threw a teacup against the wall, smashing it, with another team member, Warren Lees, later recounting, "That summed up how we were all feeling, too angry for words. We felt we'd been cheated." The New Zealand captain of the game, Jeff Howarth, was quoted after as saying, "Morally, it is not in the spirit of the game, but as it is a legal thing you have to accept it," which I don't. But it is definitely wrong in the spirit of the game. The players weren't the only ones to voice their anger and criticism. It was reported in the Canberra Times the following day, on page 1 no less, and I quote, Within seconds of the underarm delivery, newspapers, television and radio stations in Australia and New Zealand were swamped with calls expressing shame and anger. Several people rang Sydney media organisations, inquiring the location of the New Zealanders' hotel in Melbourne, so they could apologise personally. End quote. Despite the Australia victory that day, New Zealand got the last laugh the following year, when the Australian team were touring in New Zealand. It was the first day of the tour, and as Greg Chappell walked out to bat, among a chorus of boos, a lone lawn bowl rolled from out of the crowd towards him, emulating his infamous underarm decision. The underarm rule was changed shortly after in Australia, with it now being categorised as a no ball under section 21.3 of the laws of cricket. While I feel some 12th man may be the perfect way to cap this story off, owing to the difficulty of finding it on Spotify, I instead stumbled onto the song It's Just Not Cricket by the Duckworth-Lewis Method, a band not only named after an obscure cricket term, but who have a full cricket concept album too. Sunday, 2nd February can only mean one thing. That's right, woodchuck chuckers, it's Groundhog Day. Popularized outside of Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania by the 1993 Bill Murray movie of the same name, Groundhog Day was first officially celebrated on this day back in 1887. The roots of this tradition can be found in another February 2nd celebration, Candlemas, a Christian feast remembering the presentation of Jesus to the temple in Jerusalem. And a quick aside, this is also a traditional day for many to take down Christmas decorations, which is wholly the only reason mine are still up. Honest. Originally, groundhogs weren't the seer of choice for weather predictions. In Europe, where the Germans started this Candlemas forecast tradition, the animal of choice was originally the bear. When they became scarce, the hedgehog or badger were used. No matter the animal, all used the same prediction though. If the animal, on emerging from its den, casts a shadow, then it's another 4 to 6 weeks of winter. As those who practiced this tradition moved to America, specifically Pennsylvania, they had to make do with new weather-predicting animals, groundhogs, or, if you believe the law, just one groundhog, Punxsutawney Phil, a groundhog who has been alive since 1886 and owes its long life to Groundhog Punch, a life-giving elixir that it drinks every Groundhog Day picnic. While Phil's drinking his punch at these picnics, others at some of the earlier celebrations would have been dining on groundhog, whose meat was said to be tender and taste like rabbit. The meat for these feasts would be gathered in September during Groundhog Club hunts. The father of Groundhog Day, as we know it today, was Clymer Frears, an editor at the town's newspaper, the Punxsutawney Spirit, who either helped advertise for it in 1887, spreading the tradition, or helped create the Groundhog Lodge in 1899, and a lot of the mythos around Phil that is still present today, such as the Gobbler's Knob Burrow, the Groundhog Ease language, etc. Supposedly, the actual timeline of events has been a bit muddled over history. Either way, Clymer is responsible for popularizing this tradition and keeping it alive today. We can only wait to see what prediction Phil has for us all as he rises. And, as of the time of this recording, February 2nd for me is looking to be a rather disheartening 39 degrees Celsius. I can only hope that doesn't mean 6 more weeks of summer for the southern hemisphere. As for how accurate Punxsutawney Phil actually is, that's just about anyone's guess. Some studies gave him a 40% accuracy, others go as high as 70%, whereas the National Geographic Society rated his predictions as being only 28% accurate. Of course, the perfect song to close out this segment is the Sonny and Cher classic, I Got You Babe, a song recognizable from the movie Groundhog Day. And a fun fact for anyone that made it this far, It's apparently quite common for NASA to start their astronauts' day with a wake-up song. So, on June 19, 2022, the astronauts aboard Endeavour were woken up by this tune, as poor weather the day prior had seen them cancel their deorbit plans and preparations, something they had to do all over again on this day. Almost like Bill Murray, they were stuck in a time loop too. And there we have it, another episode of TDNY done and dusted, and another week of the year ahead covered. As per usual, any glaring errors or omissions, send along to thisdaynotyear@gmail.com, and you'll hear from me again next week as we look ahead to the history from the 3rd to the 9th of February. Until then,